One of the articles that this article referenced was the article on caloric restriction. Before the video, I mentioned that one road led to another. One of the articles that this article referenced was the article on caloric restriction. And many of us recognize this guy, Roy Walford, not only as Walter Longo's mentor at UCLA, but one of the major fathers of caloric restriction. He's the guy that went in with the team of 15 people into a large terrarium in the desert in Arizona for about 9 months. And here's the pictures. Before that terrarium experience, immediately on coming out, he looks like a concentration camp survivor. But then a few months later, after he's refed, and it's not that easy to tell from this view, but even with this poor view, you can begin to see he's got more definition after the refeeding episode and after having gone through that caloric restriction event. As you start getting into things like the fasting mimicking diet, that's one of the reasons that Walter Longo developed it. He said, there's no question the huge positive impact that fasting has on the human body. But number one, when he was called and talked to Dr. Walford, when Dr. Walford was in this, do you remember the name of that terrarium experiment?
The biosphere.
Biosphere, yeah. He said Walford was his advisor while he was in the biosphere, so they had to do it by phone. And he said, gosh, there was a lot of frustration and anger in there. And we all know you get grumpy when you run out of calories. So Longo's view of this was, let's see if we can trick the body into thinking that there's some fasting going on and yet make it a little bit easier than having to go through the experience that Walford and the others went through. So that's where you get that.
Ford, that's a great point about the difference between calorie restriction and intermittent or fasting mimicking diets. And one of the points that the New England Journal article brought out that I wasn't aware of is that the early studies on caloric restriction and longevity, of course, were in a mouse model and other animal models. And certainly they proved beyond the shadow of a doubt that it made the mice live longer to restrict their calories.
Yeah.
What they didn't realize initially, and what kind of had calorie restriction research going on the wrong path for a while, is that when you restrict the mice to a certain number of calories, they end up eating all of those calories in about 4 to 6 hours.
Right.
And then they're fasting for the other, 18 to 20 hours. And it really was the magic of that intermittent fasting that was more important than the caloric restriction.
Yeah, it's a good point. They brought it up in there. Are you familiar with Sachin Panda and Walter Longo's work in that space?
I really am not.
It's very much related to this. They call it TRE, time-restricted eating.
Right.
And basically, it's just closing that window. It's just saying, okay, in some of the worst examples of the modern diet, maybe even have a snack at midnight, get up whatever time you get up, 5:30, and start with breakfast. And then have 3 meals a day and how many snacks, plus, other calorie sources in between. So what they're saying is, whoa, stop that. And instead of going to 18 hours of eating and 6 hours of fasting in a 24-hour day, close that down and get to 8 hours or even 6 hours of eating and the rest fasting. And that creates some of the metabolic processes, the very positive metabolic processes that you have referred to a couple of times. It also creates some confusion because most of my patients, if they've already been down this path, they'll say, well, I'm doing intermittent fasting, which I've begun to assume, just because that's what I usually hear, they're skipping breakfast. Occasionally, I'll find someone who's skipping dinner, but usually it's skipping one of those 2 meals. And technically, you might say, well, that's time-restricted eating as opposed to intermittent fasting. But again, you saw some of that same interchange and use of intermittent fasting in the New England Journal article as well. The Louisville event was an incredible success. Many people didn't know that that was our first attempt to coordinate the whole thing ourselves. And it was better than we had hoped. A lot of focus and people saying, you know what, I know that we can deal with this together as a group. There are other people that I'm meeting here at this event that are doing the same things I'm doing and with success. I don't have to be a doctor to know all this stuff. We are going to go ahead and have another one on February 28th in the Hyatt Regency Grand Cypress in Orlando.